to session 4 of our Health and Human Rights in the Climate Crisis Conference. My name is Justine Nolan and I'm the Director of the Australian Human Rights Institute here at UNSW in Sydney. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this session on behalf of our co-conveners of this conference, the Institute on Inequalities in Global Health at USC and the George Institute for Global Health. This session is particularly special. It's sponsored by the Ingram Fund for International Law and Development. The Ingram Fund was established by Mr. James Ingram by his very generous donation to the Faculty of Law and Justice at UNSW Sydney. James Ingram AO was the former Executive Director of the United Nations World Food Programme, and we're very thankful for the Ingram Fund's support, both for this session and the broader conference. So today we're going to focus particularly on Australia and the impact of climate change related disasters, including increasing fires, floods and droughts, on the ability of people to realise their right to health. So Australia has been in the news a lot lately, not only here, where I am in Australia, but also around the world because of its laggard status in relation to its climate policies. In August this year, the former UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon declared Australia was out of step with the world on tackling climate. Last week, the former United Nations Human Rights Commissioner, Mary Robinson, criticised the Australian government's rejection of a more ambitious 2030 emission reduction target and said that Australia is an outlier at the moment in its scale of ambition. And in August this year, the largest poll that was ever conducted on Australian voters on climate change and politics in Australia found that 67% of voters believe the government should be doing more to address climate change. And just last week in New York, we saw a crowd-funded billboard in Times Square mocking Australia's climate policy. But despite this, the Australian government seems to be tinkering around the edges, which really, is giving resonance to the analogy of Nero fiddling while Rome burned. The Australian government has recently indicated there'll be no change to the 2030 target set 5 years ago on climate policy, and instead has announced the goal of reaching net zero for 2050. The question is, are we doing too little too late for our health? So this panel today is going to focus not only on what is being said, but also what can be done, by whom, and when we need to do it. Today we have 5 amazing speakers on our panel, and we aim to very much run this as a discussion. So please send in your comments via the chat, and I'll incorporate them as much as I can to our panellists. Let me introduce our 5 panellists today. Cheryl Durrant has over 30 years of experience in the national security sector, including specialist Army intelligence and defence capability roles. In her former role as Director of Preparedness and Mobilisation with the Australian Department of Defence, Cheryl led major initiatives into climate and energy sustainability. She's currently an executive member of the Australian Security Leaders Climate Group, an adjunct associate professor at UNSW and a climate counsellor. Donna Green is an associate professor at UNSW Sydney and a founding member of the Climate Change Research Centre. She is an associate investigator of the ARC Centre for Excellence on Climate Extremes and leads a national research network on Climate Health Network. She's an interdisciplinary environmental scientist and she researches climate impacts on public health, environmental health, air pollution and on Indigenous Australians. Brynn O'Brien is the Executive Director for the Australasian Centre for Corporate Responsibility, which is a research and shareholder advocacy organisation focused on holding Australian corporations to account for their environmental, social and governance performances. Prior to joining ACCR, she worked as a corporations and international human rights lawyer. Victor Steffensen is an Indigenous writer, filmmaker, musician and consultant applying traditional knowledge in a contemporary context. He's a descendant of the Tagalaka clan from North Queensland and he's the co-founder of Fire Sticks Alliance, which aims to facilitate cultural learning pathways to fire and land management. And finally, Martijn is a founding partner of the Pollination Group, an adjunct professor of international climate change law at ANU, and has over 20 years' experience in holding various roles in sustainable development and environmental law. His other current roles include the President of the World Wildlife Fund Australia and is Director also of the Climate Council. So let's start with a kick-off question to you, Donna. Can you briefly lay out for us the connection between climate change and natural disasters and how they overlay with public health concerns, and perhaps particularly in the Australian context?
Absolutely, Justine. Well, I think all Australians have experienced, early morning lack of coffee, have experienced natural disasters in their state or in their local area. So the kind of thing we're talking about would be those longer, hotter summers, so heat waves, or if they live near the coastal erosion threatening houses and beaches that they might love, or droughts or floods. So we know those natural disasters are part of living in Australia that has this hugely variable climate. What we also know now is the impacts of climate change will be making all of those natural disasters worse. And that's one thing that's really problematic, because when people think of an average climate change of maybe 0.1 or 0.2 of a degree over a longer period of time, they don't think of the extremes. And those are the extremes that are going to be affecting human health. We saw that a couple of years ago when we had that huge bushfire explosion in southeastern Sydney, where we saw this mega fire we never conceived of before. That fire weather is increased because of climate change. And that fire weather killed, very unfortunately, and made many other people have ongoing health problems because of respiratory or cardiovascular diseases that cost our economy $2 billion just from the health impacts. And we know those will be worse. So there's many problems that directly and indirectly affect our health from climate change in relation to a whole suite of natural disasters. And we need to work out how to reduce those and build resilience to them.
Thanks. And Martijn, when we hear about these issues, sort of health impacts which are immediately happening now, and as Donna said, we can see impacts like air pollution impacting our health right now. But all the talk around net zero emissions is in 2050, which is 29 years away. And as I just said, that the Australian government is not focusing on 2030. What should we be focusing on the short term, or is that 2050 goal the right one to focus? And is Australia's policy focused on 2050? Is that falling short? What should we be doing now?
Yeah, so we're basically in a climate crisis, and we need to be completely focused on 2030. Most of the governments and corporates that we deal with are actually recognising that 2030 is really the key date. That when you're assessing climate risk, you need to be thinking about 2030, not what's happening in 2050. And if we continue on the current path that we're at, we'll actually hit the Paris goals by 2030 in any event. We'll hit 1.5 degrees and we'll hit 4 degrees, 3.5 to 4 degrees by 2050. So we have to be doing everything we can in the next 10 years to rapidly reduce emissions. And even this morning, there was further there was a further communication from the IPCC about the fact is that we're just not going to hit Paris anymore. We actually got runaway climate change starting to happen, and so we have to transition very, very quickly. And we've basically got between now and 2030 if we're going to reach 1.5. Even reaching 1.5 is going to have ramifications for us in terms of climate, in terms of health. So it's not like all we're really saying is we're going to stabilise things as they are, and hopefully things won't get too much worse. But even for 2030, once we hit net zero, we need to be turning our mind as to how you reduce into negative emissions and what technologies can you adopt to reduce emissions to get you to a more stabilised climate. The government's policy, which I think Morrison put in an editorial today, about not changing 2030 is just totally irresponsible. I mean, it is what we need to be focused on. And it's all very well, one of the challenges in Australia is that some of the state governments which have adopted 2050 targets are doing that on a 2005 baseline, which was one of our worst years for emissions. So we actually need to be moving very, very quickly to doing everything that we can and really take advantage of what is a phenomenal opportunity to transform the economy.
Yeah, and I think we will come back to this sort of dissonance between state and federal governments as we talk, and also what you talk about, the opportunities, because a lot of the time we're focused on the threats rather than the opportunity. But speaking of threats, Cheryl, there's Donna and Martijn have laid out some basic facts around climate impact, and a lot of your work focuses on security threats. So how does climate figure into that notion of it being a national security threat? How do you frame that, and what does that actually mean in terms of relating it also to health impacts?
Well, there's now a sort of emerging consensus in the national security community around the world that climate change and security do have a link. And it's really, you'll hear the conversation about risk pathways. So climate change, as Donna has said, creates those fires, floods, sea level rise, heat waves, droughts. And that directly impacts on humans, their health, but also their livelihoods, their infrastructure and the ecosystems that they live in. When capacity to cope is eroded over time because those threats are coming more frequently, they're bigger, then the capacity of society to deal with those threats is eroded. And you start to see economic decline, conflict, forced migration, up to and including wars over resources. And that's a really vicious cycle for health, and health is really important in stopping this sort of risk cascade leading into those traditional security threats, is because those traditional security threats, forced migration, conflict, war, terrorism and crime also impact on human health. So our capacity to cope and our health is one of the key things in stopping these risk pathways.
And what about, Cheryl, sort of food insecurity, water insecurity? How does that figure into it as well?
Yeah, so that's there. It's one of those compound risks that if infrastructure is impacted, ecosystems impacted, and human health impacted, the capacity to generate and sort of address floods and droughts and have access to water and food is also impacted.
So we're starting to get a picture of sort of the impacts that are happening, and we've mentioned briefly the role of the government, which we'll come back to. But Brynn, a lot of your work focuses on the sort of the role of companies in relation to climate, both sort of as threats and opportunities. From what I understand, few major Australian listed companies have made credible commitments or have detailed plans around how they might align their activities with the Paris goal. What should be the role of business here and the work that you're doing? Can you explain that a little bit?
So it's worse than that, Justine. It's worse than, only a few companies having made commitments to align with Paris. It's actually the situation that we have is that there are a handful of companies in Australia and around the world. There's around 100 companies that are responsible for roughly 2/3 of the world's industrial greenhouse gas emissions over the last 30, 40 years. Those companies have no plans to stop doing what is causing climate change, which is the extraction and burning of fossil fuels. Primarily, that is really what is driving this crisis. And in Australia, while the rest of the world now starts to put in place some limits around expansion of the fossil fuels industry or basins that can't be developed, in Australia we don't have that. We still have a government or a range of governments that are continue to subsidise a handful of major corporations to keep drilling and digging fossil fuels out of the ground and selling them to be burned, and even to the point of subsidising exploration into new fossil fuels basins. This is unburnable carbon. We cannot allow it to go ahead. So we have, unfortunately, as well in Australia, a situation of state capture by the fossil fuels industry. We have companies that have and industries that have enormous influence over our political process, and we've just seen the effects of that in increased activity in digging the stuff out of the ground and selling it.
And we'll come back perhaps to you shortly in terms of business as an opportunity. So not what they're doing wrong, but perhaps where they can lead and how they might be influential, perhaps in helping government get on the right direction. But perhaps sort of a more specialised question when we're looking at it in the context of Australia in particular, Victor, some of the impacts that Donna talked about are going to be particularly hard felt in Indigenous communities and in regional Australia. And, Indigenous people need to not only have a seat at the table, but they also should be leading these discussions because of that intimate connection between land and health of the people. So I'm interested to sort of, we hear a lot of talk from the government around technology and that the sort of technology, not taxes, is the way forward. To what extent are you seeing the government or business embrace the concept that technology also should be including Indigenous technology, Indigenous knowledge, as a way for Australia to address some of these issues around climate?
Yeah, well, thanks for that. And well, first of all, Indigenous knowledge has been aware of these issues occurring to our present day from the past, since colonisation, from our elders. And they've always talked about the problems that arise within the landscape and the problems that arise within communities if people don't look after the land the right way. And when we look at the two sides of it all, we have the we have the fossil fuels of it, and that's important and crucial that that's addressed around those companies that were mentioned, and the actions of government as well around that sector. But then you've got the other side of the coin as well, which is looking after our land and looking after the country the right way. And more importantly, what people got to understand, this is about culture as well. This is about the culture of a nation and how we connect to our landscapes and how that represents in our lives. And at present, the connection to landscapes within our culture is very limited. The knowledge of the environment is very limited. We seem to be decreasing our intelligence when it comes to understanding the land better. And we seem to be increasing intelligence in terms of technologies and bells and whistles. And what we've got to be really careful of within Indigenous knowledge is, and specifically for Aboriginal people and really for the values of humanity, is that we don't allow technology to take over our responsibilities. And we need to look at technology, yes, as something that makes our life easier, maybe making our life easier, cleaning the house, doing things that we don't want to do, that allows us to do times for things that we do want to do. But one thing is for sure is that managing the land is employment, managing the land is culture, managing the land is healing for communities, for the trauma within people, even non-Indigenous people. It's the healing around better agricultural practices, shaping and molding a better culture around landscapes is really crucial. And that is what's, Aboriginal people have demonstrated over thousands of years. And the reason why sustainability was achievable was because of that. And so for us, it's about thinking about technology that is going to support Indigenous knowledge, and but not taking over the roles and responsibilities of people being out on country, managing the land firsthand, getting that experience with the land, getting that healing from landscapes, getting the employment from landscapes, allowing opportunities for our youth to access that for their education, allowing for mothers and children to attend these, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous. It's really crucial that we're maintaining a healthy culture and connection to landscapes based on the values that are natural and values that come from natural law. And there's one thing for sure is technology may be good for fighting fires, and they're creating drones that fly out immediately. But the last thing we want is technology burning our land and making decisions and taking away responsibilities of humans that is being connected to this country and as part of who we are as people in this landscape. And so some values need to be maintained as well, and for really good reasons.
Yeah, I mean, and some of the work that obviously a focus of the Fire Sticks Alliance is bringing that cultural knowledge around land management as well. Martijn, also in some of your work, I know you've been working with some Indigenous leaders to use that cultural knowledge to tackle climate issues, haven't you?
Yes, so one of the things we talk about Indigenous technology is one of the biggest Indigenous technologies, and if you use the word technology broadly in a climate sense, is savanna burning. And so one of the things that we've been doing with Charles Darwin University and KLC and others is taking Indigenous savanna burning to Africa. So DFAT funded a group of people to take what was the ISFMI program, which is a former UN program, to take Indigenous burning into sub-Saharan Africa, starting with Botswana. The process has required doing an original baselining on the ground of what the current status is and producing a methodology of taking Australian savanna burning into the region. And hopefully over time, if we export that, it'll be a major way to control fire across Africa and at the same time reduce significant emissions. So that's one area that we've been working on. The other is also around the nature crisis. So next to climate crisis is the nature crisis, and a critical part of nature crisis is actually preserving a lot of natural capital areas in the world. A lot of those areas at the moment are home and are best managed by Indigenous groups. So we can basically save nature by also empowering Indigenous groups to look after the lands in which they live, by properly funding those to ensure that they are looked after for the long term. So I think we need to start looking much more closely at the link between climate, nature and Indigenous communities and how we can tie all that together.
That seems a very Australian approach to tackle some of our great Indigenous knowledge and then to export it overseas and not always listen to our Indigenous people within our own country within that. And Victor, we'll come back to you in a moment with some more with a greater focus on that. But I want to start with the role of government, the Australian government, because we've got quite a fragmented approach between states and the federal government. Cheryl, perhaps starting with you, is this causing confusion and impeding change, or is it a way of just sort of getting to meet our targets if states are doing more and we don't need the federal government to lead on this?
Well, certainly the federal government's the drag chain on the whole of Australia, I think, moving forward on climate change. Communities, businesses, regions, states are all far more progressive than the federal government. The federal government actually has big levers of power that need to be shifted, and not just shifted in words, but shifted in actions, because it's got the taxation power of government, it's got the convening power of government, and that needs to be much greater aligned to, I think, where the bulk of Australians and the bulk of Australian businesses want to see action. And so instead of a gas-led recovery, and we rank really poorly across the OECD in terms of our post-COVID recovery spending. We're one of the worst, and we've missed this opportunity to transition our economy while we were recovering. So I think much more of we need to stop the fossil fuel subsidies and start looking at incentives to take up electric vehicles to assist the disadvantaged and those who can't afford to put solar on their homes move to solar, and to invest in the new economy, which we have huge strengths and opportunities.
So on that, Brynn, sometimes we've seen in the past that business can be very influential on government policy and perhaps can move government in a direction maybe that could be useful here. Is business moving faster than government here? Do we need business to be involved more, be involved less? What's the right balance here with Australian businesses?
The Australian business community is really divided here. There is a huge bulk of, I would say, of the Australian business community that is either somewhat positive to climate action or very positive to climate action. But then you have the rump, which is the oil and gas companies, the coal miners, to an extent the major diversified miners, the really emissions intensive, heavy emitting, big polluting companies, the utilities that know that they're in an existential fight. They know that their business models cannot, in some cases, or they're not prepared to align their business model with Paris. So they are fighting to hold us back. It's a really fascinating time, because what we're starting to see is that those climate aware businesses are starting to use their voice more. We're seeing the Business Council of Australia is an industry association that represents a big diverse set of Australian big business, and the kind of policy transformation that organisation has undergone, and the ambition transformation that organisation has gone just over the last 3 years has been pretty incredible. So at the last federal election, the Business Council of Australia said that the Labor Party's 45% emissions reduction target was an economy-wrecking target. That was the quote from the CEO, Jennifer Westacott, going into the last federal election cycle. Just a few short years later, we have the Business Council saying that a 50% target is a sensible, reasonable target. So we've seen a kind of realignment within that organisation. We still have, of course, the fossil fuels representatives, so the Australian Petroleum Lobby, APPEA, still arguing for spreading misinformation about the physical properties of gas, so saying that gas is clean energy, but also arguing for subsidies for expansion of new fossil fuels basins. So we do have this very live contest in the Australian business community about what should happen. Unfortunately, the side of subsidies is still ahead, is still winning, but the side of decarbonisation is gaining traction and power.
And Donna, are you seeing this sort of fragmentation between state governments, federal governments, business impacting in your research about how we might move ahead and how we address it? Is there confusion around what we should be doing?
Yes. So if you look from the outside and you look to what Australia is doing, it's just too embarrassing to even admit how poorly we're doing on the world stage. but that's not reflected at the state level. Broadly, our states and territories have relatively strong commitments to a near-term and further-term target. We've had our major states committing billions of dollars into investing into this energy transition. And very importantly, this is a problem that does have a solution. I think it's important to talk about this in a frame of knowing that we can actually electrify. We can electrify with renewables, with heat pumps, at the domestic level, but actually also transitioning our industries to ensure people who were employed directly and indirectly by fossil fuel industries can be part of this new system. And we could be a world leader in that. We're looking at huge investments in renewable energy deployment across the country, also with batteries and storage mechanisms to enable not only our entire country to transition to renewable energy, green electrons, but also to be able to use that as an export industry to go through to Southeast Asia. So what we need to do is make that happen and make it happen quickly. I'm working with a fantastic guy, Saul Griffith, who's this American-Australian inventor, who has managed to calculate the costs of moving the whole of Australia to renewable and actually being able to start an export industry. And it will actually save, I'm going to say it again, save money for all Australian households, $5,000 a year once we make that transformation. So we should not use the constraints of either the federal or even the state governments about what we think we can do. We should actually look at the numbers. We need to make this transition happen tomorrow. Even 2030 is too far away. We can start doing this now, and we must start doing this now.
So, Victor, we've heard it. Oh, sorry, go Martijn first before I go. Yeah, follow on.
Yes, so one of the challenges that we face here is that there is no plan, right? So Barnaby Joyce says, I don't want to commit to net zero because there's no plan. Well, he is the government, right? He and Morrison should be able to come up with a plan to deliver this. It's a bit silly to say to the public, you haven't got a plan for me to do as a government. It's the government's job to do that. So the first problem is there's no plan on transition. We know that coal is going to be out of the system in due course. It's already, many of those assets are stranded. The banks aren't going to finance them. So why isn't the government developing a significant transition plan as they did in the UK and other countries? Secondly, the other interesting dynamic here is that many of the states are trying to position themselves about how to be a leader, but they're not actually talking to each other. So we have an energy system that runs across the whole east coast of Australia. It's a national electricity market. What you do in one state affects the other. So the states should be talking together about how to build a new energy system, not doing it just for their states. And what's pretty interesting then also finally is just the role of the law and litigation here. So we're seeing a lot of people use litigation as a means of driving change. So as you will know, Santos is being sued at the moment for using the term clean gas, the fact that there is no such thing as clean gas. There's litigation against the government for issuing green bonds and not disclosing the fact they weren't green. There's litigation against the government for issuing grants to gas, which is a high emitting fuel. So there's a lot of different pieces of litigation going on at the moment. And in other countries, we've seen those linked to health and human rights as well. And so I think that will be a significant driver as well as we go forward. So I think it's really interesting that how effective law is being used both at a corporate level, but also at a more human rights level as well.
Yeah, and some of those cases we're seeing put pressure on Australia internationally as well, and on international governments. And actually in the closing session of this conference, we'll be featuring one of the young climate activists who has brought one of the cases against the Federal Environment Minister, arguing that she has a duty of care in relation to children and the way that they craft environmental policy. So we're going to continue to explore that, particularly in our closing session of this conference this week. Sort of, if I build on then from the recent comment, Martijn, that you just gave around this need to work together. We didn't exactly see that with state governments during the pandemic. That we had, one of the greatest emergencies that we had faced as a country in recent times, and it felt like in a federation that every state or man or woman was for themselves. So what is it, Cheryl, that is going to be about climate change that is going to make this approach different? How do we build a more collaborative approach between both governments at different levels and business?
Well, Martijn, I think, spoke quite rightly about needing to have a plan, but before that, you sort of need to have a strategy and a vision. So I don't think we in Australia know where we want to go or who we want to be as a nation going forward. And it's actually the power of the vision not the fear of the threat, that builds consensus. So who doesn't want to see an Australia that is doing the heavy lifting globally, is a leader in the planet, has shifted to renewables as a leader, and is therefore reaping the benefits for Australian society and business, and off the back of those benefits has capacity to help out other nations, because while Australia is an island, climate change is not an issue that can be dealt with by individual nations. There has to be collaboration not only between our states but also globally, as we're finding with COVID that we do need the rest of the world. So I think there's got to be that sense of vision that we're not getting from our leaders, and that needs to, I think, happen first to lead into the planning.
I mean, but how do we build this sense of urgency? So as a if I'm from the outside, a non-climate specialist, and I hear that we're moving to 2050, we're moving to 2030, I still feel that's a very long way away. And so how do we build and educate awareness around that, not only at government, but also within the broader community? Because Brynn, you said before that there's been quite a shift, say, from the Business Council in the rhetoric that they spoke about 3 or 4 years ago to now. So how do we continue to build on that?
Look, I think it takes everyone. Climate change is a threat, an immediate threat to the health and human rights of everyone on this panel, everyone listening in. So everyone has to take some responsibility for thinking about it, learning about it, having conversations with their communities about it. What we're sorely missing at this moment in time is leadership from the federal government. We have, as we've discussed, pockets of leadership emerging in state and local government, some leadership from the business community, although the business community is to a large extent still kind of pretty conservative on these issues. We have fantastic leadership in First Nations communities. We have, and we need to be listening more and taking action in support of First Nations communities. There are pockets of leadership emerging in the trade union movement. It's by no means a done deal, and it's by no means kind of consistent across the board. But we are seeing, organised workers start to fight for their own transition. But really, we all, it's a responsibility for all of us to start taking action.
And I sort of throw this open a little bit to anyone around that. We've talked about the role of business here, but we also need to think about accountability for business. And one of the questions from the audience is coming in that says, there's always a tension in having business lead, even if government is not acting as they should. So how do we ensure the accountability of business for their actions in climate, and what methods of accountability are best? So Martijn, you spoke about law, but throwing this open, perhaps starting with you, Brynn, what methods of accountability perhaps are you working on, or do you think we need to focus on in relation to business here?
Yeah, again, business is diverse. So what ACCR does is we deal with major listed corporations, and there are a bunch of major listed corporations in this country that are having a really negative effect on our climate, on the Earth's climate. So we hold shares in major listed corporations, and we go out and engage with them using the powers afforded to shareholders. We put shareholder resolutions, we have meetings, we mobilise the institutional investment sector around much more ambitious climate demands. That's another tool. We're also the litigant in the legal case that Martijn mentioned against Santos around what we are concerned is misleading statements made about gas as a fuel. There are, a range of other tools. Certainly, there are others who are more expert on them, but really there is that power in relation to listed corporations in order to have conversations and change them using shareholder rights.
So another question from the audience, perhaps starting with Donna or Cheryl, are there good examples at the very local level of local government responses in Australia, even with the difficulties of the national government response and differences among states? So does anyone have examples, Martijn, Cheryl, Donna, of local governments leading in this area?
Yeah, well, I think one of the things about local governments is there was a significant movement pre-COVID, or for many of the local governments to declare climate emergencies. So I think that momentum, many governments around Australia did that. It therefore recognised what was, a critical platform for governments to then take action. There was, interestingly, one or two local governments where they were not so supportive of that, but ultimately it's happened in most areas. That then gives them the policy platform to actually start taking local actions. A lot of it's focused on renewables, electric vehicle charging, adaptation, understanding the impacts of climate change on their local government areas, and I think that's been quite important in that. I just want to come back to one point which was raised before, and that's this issue of the role of government. Because not whether it's local government or national government, we need really good government policy to drive change. Business is not going to do it on its own. The acceleration of this issue requires strong targets, strong transition plans. You look at what's happening in Europe, where they basically say, in Norway, by a particular point in time, 2027, we must have the phase out of all combustion vehicles. It sets a timeline, it sets an agenda, it sets an investment horizon, and people work towards that. Here, we're having an argument about whether we should be taxing electric vehicles, let alone incentivising them. It's sort of, bordering on the ridiculous. So in order to accelerate the change, you need to have obligations on companies to reduce emissions. The federal government has in place a legislation already called the Safeguard Mechanism. People don't realise that is basically an emissions trading scheme. We need to have that so that everybody's under an obligation. We need, where there is technology that could be implemented, the government to provide guarantees against risk that will accelerate the deployment. We need tax policy to be looked at. I'm not talking about carbon tax. I'm talking about many of the largest polluters in Australia pay no tax. So if we can get some of those large polluters to start paying tax and use that tax towards subsidising some of the new technology rollouts, we're also in a much better position. But too often government here is dictated to by large business, and they're not actually, government's is not setting an agenda that's required to deal with what is an emergency.
So Victor, coming back to you, sort of, you're looking at some of the impacts of this lack of planning of government, of business, and sort of, this sort of running roughshod, as you will, around the country. So let's go back to that question I was asking you earlier around the importance of educating people and making people aware about that connection between land and culture and health. Could you speak a little bit about that from your perspective?
Well, when we have an unhealthy landscape and we start to see a diminishing landscape, we start to see impacts on culture, health, everyone, no matter who you are, white, black, brindle, or brown, and it's all about a healthy landscape. And when we look at sustainability, it's based on healthy landscapes. And so for Aboriginal people, it's highly crucial that when we're looking at landscapes and and the elders are saying there's no more bush tucker left there, or there's no certain animals there too that they used to see as a kid, then they're visual, monitoring that, they're suggesting that there's a problem in the landscape. And when we can't see those resources, whether it be plant or animals, then we can't share that knowledge. Therefore, the doors start to close. When we see doors closing from decline of our plants and animals. And that's something that really is a big issue here as well, because when we have a unhealthy landscape, that's what this is really about. We hear about policies and governments, and we hear about putting solar panels, and that's all really important. But once again, we always miss the other side of the coin here. Well, you're all going to have solar panels on your roofs, but you're still going to have wildfires. You're still going to have decline in the plants and animals. You got to understand that majority of Australia is under threat, not just from climate change, but already under threat from mass extinction, from neglect and ignorance. And that's something that comes from people, not from the sun. And that's why the whole thing is missing here, like always on a one-sided sort of talk. And like I'm saying, it is important, but what we're saying for so long is that, we need to start managing the land better as well, and understand that the land is the key for a healthy economy of the future. And if we start to see the doors close on culture, we start to see the doors close on opportunities around the green economics as well. And that's why it's a whole area that hasn't been even tapped into. And that is what our native resources give us and have provided for people for thousands of years is still being ignored and not even listened to, let alone the management of the landscape. And that's why it's for me, it's just continue to demonstrate that, and knowing that preparedness is not just looking at the fossil fuels. Yes, highly important, but the other side of the coin of preparedness is getting people on the right track and starting to mold a pathway for the youth in terms of what needs to happen, the green jobs of the future, the way that we develop credit schemes that are not just based on carbon, but based on far greater outcomes around our biodiversity, around healing landscapes that are very sick, that have no trees left, that have no native grasses, that no longer have hardly any native animals on those countries. And healing those landscapes is something that people don't have the knowledge of and skills, and let alone managing the land continuously with fire forevermore from here. So there's a lot of work to do around training, around educating people, and around changing the paradigms of research as well, so that monies are not wasted into theories, that monies are into practical solutions that are doing the work immediately now in terms of healing landscapes and seeing tangible results that are flowing into community, improving lifestyles, and seeing a great improvement in our landscape within our own visual eyes and not through data. And that's something that is plain and simple, that people in general want to see around Australia and around the world. I mean, we saw the statistics, 67% people want to see more done about climate change. Well, I reckon it's higher than that when it comes to people wanting to see a better landscape and planet for their children into the future. And so that's the side of the thing that we need to be serious about. And the more that we're able to educate people around all the fine detail here and not just skimming over the top, then we're forevermore not preparing our society for what's to come ahead of the future, but more importantly, preparing them for hope and the good work ahead of us instead of the arguments and the debates.
Which you unknowingly gave me the perfect segue into a question from the audience, which I'll open up. It was the question of, why do you think the media doesn't report proportionately about the climate and biodiversity crises? They tend to comment on political consequences, but not biophysical consequences. How do we change how the media deals with this crisis? What should we be pushing in this area? Perhaps, Victor, I'll give you the first right to response and then open it up to someone else.
Yeah. Well, I'd like to say something about that is, how can we, when we have, like look at the Indigenous voice, for example. It can't be heard. I mean, look at the women's voice. It can't be heard in the past, until now. I mean, look at the people in general's voice in terms of wanting change. It can't be heard. I mean, and why? You got to ask yourself why. Because we have no leadership. We have a government that is in the pocket of the mining giants and of all these people that are destroying our planet. Look, our economy is based on destruction, and our governments are sewed right up into that. And so we're not going to get anywhere with a situation like that. And we're not going to get anywhere with the people that are lost and expecting the government to make the changes. I mean, we need to start making changes now as a country and as a nation. And that's what's happening and being demonstrated through the work with Fire Sticks and with the work around the fire space with Indigenous Knowledge is now getting the support of everyone in every sector around the country that's within agriculture, within non-Indigenous sector, Indigenous, you name it, private landholders. Lots of people are getting on board in understanding the need for this and understanding the need to kick off projects, and no matter how big or small in their own regions, to start that process of gaining that momentum and spinning the cogs all over the place. That's going to build that momentum and start that actual work, good work to begin on the community level. That I think is the only way we can sort of influence governments as well, by getting people stronger.
Do anyone else want to jump in on that one around the role of the media? Cheryl, go ahead.
So I think the role of the media for me is a symptom of the sort of economic model we have. We look to media still for news and for information. Well, that's not the business model of most media. It's actually to make a profit. And we even have it called Nine Entertainment now. It recognises what it really is. So I think that the common good, it's the weakness of the common good in our economic model. There just isn't that sort of neutral public good focused organisation that's not driven by profit or not driven by shareholder dividends. It's actually driven, its whole model is different. So I think the reframing or coming up with new economic models also addresses the issue we currently have with media. And it's actually conversations like this that are critical, because here we have genuine facts and we have genuine people here for the public good, not to make a profit.
I think I'd just add to that. I think the basic problem is there's absolutely no accountability or transparency from politicians or the media. So there is not, these our elected representatives, whether it's on Q&A or on the media, lie all the time, and no one holds them accountable. They regularly say things that aren't true. They regularly present false statements about climate, and this is our elected representatives, and they don't seem to be held to account very often, or actually very rarely, or almost never. And the media often just reinforces that, and there's very little accountability for the media as well. So I think picking up some of the points that Victor made are actually spot on. And even when we try to get ICAC in, some federal sort of corruption body, or even when we have Craig Kelly coming back to the health issue, who's a government minister going on an anti-vax campaign when the government's trying to get people vaccinated for COVID, just demonstrates how ludicrous the situation is.
Brynn, and then Donna. Oh, sorry, Donna, go ahead first.
Well, I think a perfect example of this, again, just to go back to it, is we have a solution. I'm really keen not to just frame climate change as a problem. Notwithstanding, Victor, absolutely believe we should actually bring Indigenous engagement along with that larger solution to look at healthy land, healthy people, along with making technological change. We know that there is a solution. Again, we can understand that this green transformation, using green electrons, using renewable and listening to the land can occur. It saves money and it saves emissions. That is crucial. We have to make it. We have to have a high ambition. We have to have a strong ambition, and we need to follow leadership. We shouldn't get stuck in the detail of the weeds, which is what an unholy alliance between the politicians and the media are about, just explaining the nuances of how difficult the problem is. We in Australia, with the Indigenous voice, can be an incredibly powerful force for change and show leadership at the international stage. And we need to start making and realizing that transformation can happen now. It could have happened yesterday, but let's not leave it a second longer. That's what we really need to do to show that change. We already have all the states and territories signed up to agreements. It's the federal government, which is, it's not just laggard, it's not an outlier, it's worse than that. It's shameful what the federal government is doing and destroying our reputation, our capabilities for all the voices of all the underrepresented Australians in the world stage. This needs to stop now. This needs to stop now, and we need to make transformational change, and we need to find those leaders. They're probably the youth voice. They're very strongly, obviously, the Indigenous voice. And let's start smashing walls, because what have we got to lose at this point? The only thing we've got to lose is a future that's going to be hot, horrible, miserable, and run by old white men. Let's change that, and let's change it now.
Sometimes when you host a panel, you're really worried that the panel won't tell you what they think. So I don't have that so much fear with these panelists today. Brynn, you want to just come in on the end of that?
Oh, just, echoing everyone else's points at this stage, incredible to be on a panel of people that acknowledge capitalism at the root of this problem, that acknowledge colonisation at the root of this problem, that acknowledge corruption and capture at the root of this problem, and to the point on media, that acknowledge confusion, because really what the fossil fuels industry has done, and there's examples of it just in the last couple of days, is spend decades buying up ad space, buying up advertorial space in every paper. From yesterday it was the Daily Telegraph and the Australian, all the way through to the New York Times. Exxon's been buying ads for decades in the New York Times and getting positive stories about fossil fuels published. So yes, there is this kind of profit-driven capitalist model at the heart of the media problem, but there's also an incredibly deliberate campaign by the other side to confuse. I mean, we talk about that statistic, 70% of Australians want more action on climate change. What on earth is the other 30% thinking? I mean, I have never met a person who has really understood climate change, and then stopped thinking about it, right? Who has actually understood it at its core and what it means, as you know, as Donna said, that you know, the horrible, hot, miserable, sad world that we are leaving to our children and grandchildren if we don't stop this runaway climate change. Who has understood that and then not been active on it?
So we're almost out of time, and I just want to ask you all one question to finish with it. So if you were, and you know, some of you have touched on this already, but if you were suggesting sort of a singular focus of action in the next 5 years, and you were speaking to either government, business, or civil society, what would you be pushing in order to curb the impacts of climate on health? Cheryl, start with you.
So for me, the one thing I would do is, from a civil society angle, is just ask yourself, what more can you do? As the number of the panelists have said, the action time's now. So think about reflect, take stock, and say, how can I do more? What can I do? Where am I called to sort of join the struggle?
Terrific. Victor, what would you focus on in the next 5 years?
Focusing on the next 5 years is building the capacity of communities right across the country, connecting with each other and mentoring each other with programs around water, fire, everything, and a great education system for our kids based on the solutions.
And Donna, if you had sort of the ear of government, business, or civil society, what would you be focusing on to curb the impacts of climate on health?
I'd actually just like to follow on Cheryl's comment. What's really important is people don't just think that they can only have the strength to impact their personal space. So you as an individual, of course, wouldn't it be nice if you had a Tesla car and you changed your light bulbs, but actually to think bigger than that. In order to transform politicians and media, you need to go to those politicians. You have one. They're paid by your tax dollars to represent you. Let them know your thoughts. Tell your friends to let them know your thoughts, and do not give up. Be a tenacious bulldog. Grab hard, bite hard, and make some change.
Martijn?
Yeah, I think sorry, I dropped out. My Wi-Fi went down, so just back on my phone now.
Perhaps the government was listening.
Maybe. I think also, look, just coming back to one comment I want to make, let's not be too naive here. The reality is that if you do want real change, you do need capitalism, right? So when you look at what Tesla's done, and you look at what in the last 6 months, there have been 5 of the biggest asset managers in the world have collectively committed over $30 billion towards transitioning this economy, right? And making major investments. What we now need to do is hold them to account. We need to make sure they actually do spend the money and they do find the investments, and they do drive the change, because there's often many of these announcements that don't get traction. So to do that, you need good policy, and you need to lobby governments and need to work with those corporate leaders that are prepared to drive change. And then, as Brynn is doing, go after those that are not. And I think, there is a new form of capitalism evolving, and there are people who are very interested in trying to save the planet, and we've got to work with those parts of the ledger. We can't completely dismiss it. So I think we've got to advocate for very strong policy, make sure that those companies that are trying to drive the transition get support, and that they do drive. We replace old technologies with new technologies, and we really, get on what is a phenomenal opportunity to transform the global economy.
And Brynn, the final word to you.
Well, very practically, we need to prevent the opening up of new fossil fuels projects and basins. We have to stop Woodside going ahead with Scarborough. We have to stop the Beetaloo going ahead. That Origin Energy are up there, Empire, Tamboran Resources, Santos. We have to stop that project, those projects going ahead. That carbon has to stay in the ground. So whatever you can do, whether it's talking to your utilities provider, contacting your politician, getting in the way of physically of these projects going ahead, that is where we're at. And yes, Martijn, we need capitalism to catch up, but we also need to put ourselves in the way of where it's going right now.
Yeah, sure, I agree, but we just need everything. We've got to, as we said at the beginning, Donna said, we've got a crisis here. We need to pull everything out of the bag at the moment. It's not just a question of, we've got to pull every trigger and every single lever we can to get this moving fast.
I think, as the Biden administration said this week, we're going to do everything we can, and we're going to get up tomorrow morning and we're going to do more.
So let that be a call to action for all of you. And thank you so much for joining us today. And a particular thanks to Brynn O'Brien, Cheryl Durrant, Victor Steffensen, Donna Green and Martijn Wilder for this session, where they have been very forthright in what needs to be done, but also given us that there is some optimism and there is hope that we can still create change, that we are not too late, but we need to listen to and hold to account all the stakeholders involved. So thank you very much for joining us today for this session. Please join us. We're looking forward to our discussion tomorrow on looking at the issue of economic inequality through the climate crisis and its impacts on access to health and healthcare more broadly on a global scale. So please join us for that session, and thank you to everybody for joining us today.